The wind roared like a wild animal. I was there, standing at my living room window, feeling the glass vibrate as Hurricane Milton approached. No one imagined it would arrive so strong. Category 6, the first of its kind. The news kept repeating the warning, "Evacuate. Leave now." But it was too late for us. Me, Maria, and our little son, Lucas, were already trapped. Lightning streaked across the sky in quick flashes, and each crash caused the ground to shake. Outside, the trees bent as if they were made of paper. The rain fell with a fury I had never seen before, flooding the streets in a matter of minutes. The light blinked a few times before going out for good, and in the dark, I heard the sharp sound of shattering glass. It was Lucas's upstairs bedroom window. I ran towards the bedroom, my heart racing. Lucas was on the floor, shaking, holding the teddy bear that always accompanied him. "It's okay, son, Dad is here," I said, trying to hide the terror that was taking over me. But how do you stay calm when the world outside seems to be falling apart? The storm didn't let up, becoming more violent every second. Maria came towards us, her eyes wide with fear but trying to hold her ground. "The basement," she whispered. "We need to go to the basement now." We took what we could get, a few bottles of water, flashlights, and a blanket. With each step, the wind howled louder as if it were trying to enter the front door. We walked down the hall, past the shards of glass from the broken window, until we reached the basement. I locked the door tightly, as if that piece of wood could protect us from the relentless force outside. Inside the basement, the darkness was almost absolute, except for the dim beam of the flashlight. The noise outside was deafening, branches and debris banging against the house, shingles coming loose, the metallic sound of something being dragged. Maria looked at me with eyes full of questions, but I had no answers. I just held Lucas close to me, waiting for it to pass. But deep down, I knew we were at the mercy of the greatest force of nature we had ever faced. The sound outside seemed to grow louder and louder, as if the hurricane was taking on a life of its own. There in the basement, time seemed to not pass. I could feel the walls vibrating with each gust of wind. The earth shook, as if the ground was about to open up and swallow us. Maria tried to distract Lucas with a story, but her voice shook, betraying the fear that also consumed her. The cold began to seep in, cutting through our blankets. Lucas, with his face buried in my chest, repeated softly, "When will it end, Daddy?" I wanted to be able to say that soon, that everything would be okay, but the words refused to come out. Instead, I stayed silent, trying to hear what was going on outside, trying to predict Hurricane Milton's next move. In a moment, there was a loud noise, as if something gigantic had ruptured. Maria and I exchanged a quick look, our hearts beating in our throats. I got up slowly, going to the small basement window that looked out onto the garden. Outside, a lamppost had fallen, tearing part of the fence and leaving a tangle of wires on the ground sparking. It was like a warning that Milton was far from calming down. What scared me most was the idea that this wasn't the height of the storm. On the news, they said that the eye of the hurricane was still approaching, and that after that things would get worse. I closed my eyes for a second, trying to shake off the image of our house collapsing on top of us. I tried to focus on our survival. What I would do if water started coming into the basement, if the ceiling gave way. I didn't know how to swim well, and Lucas was so small, but I had to find a way out. I had to believe that we could do it. Minutes dragged by like hours. The silence inside the basement contrasted with the cacophony outside, creating an almost unbearable tension. I sat down again next to Maria and Lucas and took their hands. Maria squeezed mine tightly, as if that would anchor us to reality, to life. "I love you," she whispered, almost like a prayer. And at that moment, I realized that what scared me most wasn't the hurricane, but the possibility of not being able to see their faces after this was all over. Suddenly, an even stronger gust shook the walls and I felt a tremor run through the floor. The noise that came next was louder, unlike any other. A crack, a metallic groan, and then the house shook. Maria gave a muffled scream and Lucas shrank further into my arms. The sound of water began to echo, a trickle that soon became a steady stream. Every second, the water level rose. I flashed my flashlight toward the corner of the basement and saw a trickle of water widening, soaking the concrete floor. Maria covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide. "Now, what do we do?" At that moment, I knew we couldn't stay there much longer. We needed to get out of the basement before we became prisoners of an underground aquarium. But where to go? The hurricane continued to rage outside, and the darkness was absolute. I felt the weight of the decision, and an invisible pressure tightened my chest. But hesitating now could cost us our lives. I needed to be strong. I needed to guide my family out of that nightmare. The water continued to invade the basement, and faster and faster. It already reached my ankles, cold and cloudy, while the hurricane wind made a sharp sound like a desperate scream. I needed to act quickly. I picked Lucas up and looked at Maria, who was shaking uncontrollably. "We have to get out now, before this turns into a swimming pool." She nodded, and together we walked up the steps toward the basement door. When we opened the door, the force of the wind almost threw us back inside. The house was unrecognizable. The windows on the ground floor had been ripped out and furniture was lying everywhere. Water was already covering the living room floor. We stumbled through the wreckage, and I forced myself to remain calm. We needed to get to the kitchen, where there was a door that led to the backyard. But when we got there, I realized that the scene outside was even worse. Trees had been uprooted. The street was a fast-flowing river. In the midst of the chaos, a car had turned sideways, almost blocking the exit. "We can't get out this way," I shouted to Maria, trying to overcome the deafening noise of the wind. We returned to the room, not knowing exactly what to do. "What if we go up to the attic?" Maria suggested, her voice shaking. The idea made sense. We could stay above water at least for a while. I agreed and helped her climb the stairs while carrying Lucas. Each step was uncertain, with the wood creaking and creaking beneath our feet. We reached the attic, which was a cramped space, full of old boxes and souvenirs that now seemed so irrelevant. We tried to fit in what was left of space. I could hear the sound of water getting closer and closer, like an invisible monster coming up the steps. Lucas cried softly, and Maria hugged him tightly. I tried to find something that could give us a way out, but all I saw were the walls that surrounded us. With every minute, the sound of the wind increased, and I knew the worst was yet to come. We were in the eye of the hurricane, that brief moment of calm that only precedes the return of hell. I looked through the crack of a small window in the attic and saw the dark sky opening for a moment. But in the distance, the dense clouds swirled, ready to crash down on us again. That moment of calm was like a breather before diving again. But this breathing did not bring relief. It only prolonged the terror. Lucas fell asleep in Maria's arms, exhausted from crying. I took the opportunity to look out the window again, and it was then that I saw, in the distance, a wave of darkness approaching, the return of the storm. When the eye of the hurricane passed, the second act of the nightmare began. The wind returned even stronger, throwing debris against the house. The roof began to creak, as if it was about to split in two. Maria and I exchanged a look of pure despair. "If the roof gives way, we won't have a chance," she whispered. "It won't budge." I tried to lie, but even I didn't believe my words. Water began to infiltrate the attic walls, running down the corners. The structure of the house buckled, groaning as if it too was struggling to survive. And suddenly, a sharp sound echoed above our heads. The roof was falling apart. A piece of the structure gave way, leaving a hole through which the wind and rain invaded with fury. Maria screamed, and I instinctively threw myself at her and Lucas to protect them. The rain hit us hard, like little sheets of ice. Lucas woke up from the impact, screaming in fear. "Daddy, what's going on?" I didn't have an answer. There was no way to protect ourselves from that destructive force. The attic, which was supposed to be our refuge, was now a dangerous trap. But then an insane thought occurred to me. What if we used the hole in the roof to escape? Maybe we could climb to the top of the house and wait for help there. "Maria, we need to go up," I said, pointing to the hole. "It's our only chance." She hesitated, but when the water began to rise even faster, she didn't argue. I ripped up one of the old curtains in the attic and made a makeshift rope. With great difficulty, we managed to lift Lucas, who held on with all his strength. We climbed up one by one, grabbing the pieces of wood from the roof. The wind was pushing us back, trying to throw us back. When we finally managed to reach the top of the house, we crouched down, trying to protect ourselves from the cold and the force of the wind. The scene around us was devastating. Where there were once streets, there was now a sea of muddy water and debris. Up there, as I held Lucas and Maria against my chest, I realized the fragility of our existence. We were at the mercy of nature, powerless, tiny. I looked at the horizon and saw the sky breaking into lightning, as if the sky itself was at war with itself. With each new thunderclap, Lucas clung tighter to me, his small body shaking with fear. Maria tried to contain her crying, and I searched within for a strength that I didn't know if it still existed. We were on top of the house, exposed, and the rain was relentless. There was nowhere else to run. I held tight to Maria's hand as we felt the wind push us to one side, threatening to drag us away. The water rose even faster, and some of the surrounding houses were submerged up to the roof. It was an apocalyptic scenario, and I felt like it was the end of the world. The only hope was that someone would see us there, that a rescue team would be nearby. And it was then that, amidst the chaos, I spotted something in the distance lights. Lights flashing through the darkness. My heart sped up with a mixture of relief and fear. It could be the help we were waiting for, but it could also be just another reflection, a mirage in the middle of the nightmare we were living. I screamed for help with all my strength until my throat burned. Maria did the same, shaking one of the t-shirts she had managed to bring from the attic. The lights approached, and I realized it was a rescue boat, maneuvering with difficulty between the rubble and the current. It was our chance, the last. When I realized that the lights were coming towards us, a thread of hope lit up inside me. But at the same time, the rain and wind gave no respite. The rescue boat moved slowly, dodging debris floating in the raging current. I held Lucas steady and continued to wave the flashlight frantically. It was our chance, but we also knew that with the sea of water that had formed in the streets, any mistake could be fatal. Maria next to me was waving a piece of white fabric trying to attract attention. Our screams were drowned out by the howling wind, but we didn't give up. Finally, one of the lights seemed to find us, illuminating our tired, drenched faces. One of the rescuers waved back, gesturing for us to wait. I knew they had to be careful with the currents, which could capsize the boat at any moment. The boat got closer, and now we could hear the voice of the man calling us. "Let's try throwing a rope," he shouted, fighting the sound of the storm. He threw a heavy rope towards us, but the wind diverted its course, and it fell into the water and was carried away by the current. "Try again," I shouted back, holding Lucas with one arm and trying to stretch the other towards the floating rope. On the second attempt, the rope reached us. Maria grabbed it, and I helped her tie it to a piece of the roof structure, reinforcing it with tight knots. The rescuer signaled us to start descending slowly, using the rope as a guide. Maria was first, with her eyes closed and her body shaking with cold and fear. I held on to Lucas with all my might, climbing down behind her. The next few moments were a mix of chaos and relief. The current almost knocked us over when our feet hit the water, but we managed to stay upright all the way to the boat. The strong arms of the rescuers lifted us, first Maria and then Lucas, who was crying uncontrollably. When I was finally pulled into the boat, I felt the weight of the world lift off my shoulders for a moment. But the fight was far from over. The boat was rocking dangerously as it tried to return to calmer waters. All around us, the rubble of destroyed houses floated past like ghosts of a neighborhood that was once our neighborhood. I looked at the place where our house was and realized that if we had stayed a few more minutes, the basement would have become our tomb. The water now covered almost the entire roof. The rescuer beside me, a man with a face lined with exhaustion, gave me a knowing look. "You did well to hold on tight," he said, as he watched the waves toss the boat from side to side. Many were not as lucky. In the distance, another boat was carrying out a rescue. I saw a father holding his son on his shoulders, trying to cross the current to safety. The image made me hold Lucas even tighter. I thought about all the families who, like us, faced that nightmare without knowing if they would see sunlight again. But there was also one certainty. We had survived Milton's fury, at least so far. As the boat struggled against the waves, the feeling of relief turned into a new form of anxiety. With every bump, it felt like the storm was trying to pull us back. Lucas grabbed my neck, burying his face in my shoulder, while Maria, beside me, kept her eyes fixed on the darkness around us. It seemed like the worst was over, but I knew that any wrong move could plunge us back into chaos. The hurricane's waters were treacherous, with submerged debris appearing suddenly like traps waiting to capsize the speedboat. The boat pilot shouted instructions to other rescuers trying to maintain control. "The current is stronger, we need more strength," he exclaimed, his voice almost being swallowed by the sound of the wind. I held on, trying to keep my balance, as I watched the choppy waters crash against the remains of the houses. The darkness was total. The horizon blended with the sky, and it was impossible to know where the storm ended and the sea began. Suddenly a bang echoed and the boat gave a sudden jolt. "A log!" someone shouted, and we saw the piece of wood disappear into the current. The engine groaned, losing power for a moment. The pilot crouched down and began fiddling with something, his face scrunched up with concern. Every minute seemed like an eternity. The feeling that we could lose the battle against nature was real and suffocating. But then, little by little, the waves began to lose strength, and the boat stabilized. The rain continued to fall, but the thunder became more distant, as if the fury of the hurricane was finally moving away. "We're almost there, guys, hang in there," said the pilot, with a tone that mixed tiredness and determination. The road to the rescue point was long, and I knew that the impact of what we had experienced had not yet fully reached us. The fear remained there, but at the same time, something else emerged. The hope that maybe, just maybe, we could start over. Lucas finally fell asleep in my arms, exhausted, and Maria leaned against me, closing her eyes for a few seconds. I hugged them, feeling that somehow this moment would forever be remembered as the milestone of our survival. We still didn't know what we would find when we reached dry land, but in that moment together, we allowed ourselves to believe that there was a future beyond the hurricane. The journey to the rescue point was marked by constant tension. The rain finally began to lose its intensity, but the wind was still blowing hard, whipping our faces as the boat advanced through the choppy waters. The lights of the rescue team's flashlights and headlights were like small stars in the midst of total darkness, punctuating a path that seemed endless. As we advanced, I began to notice the destruction around me more clearly. Houses were submerged up to their roofs. Cars were floating like toys in a bath of dirty water, and entire trees which once lined the neighborhood's streets were now toppled over, entangled with each other. It was as if a giant had passed through, crushing everything in its path. A part of me wondered how it would be possible to rebuild it all. Not just the houses, but the lives that were affected, the memories that were lost in the waters. I forced myself to think only of Lucas and Maria, who were now sleeping exhausted. I tried to ignore the crushing weight of the reality that awaited us on the other side. Yet I couldn't help but think about the neighbors who stayed behind, the children at Lucas's school, the elderly people who might not have been able to escape in time. This was the cruel face of Hurricane Milton, which weather forecasts failed to convey. The rescuer next to us finally broke the silence, speaking in a low tone that seemed to respect the gravity of the moment. "You were lucky to be able to get up to the roof. The tide came in very quickly. It caught a lot of people off guard." He glanced at the horizon where lightning lit the sky in a brief glow. "There are places where the water reached more than 3 meters high." I nodded, swallowing hard. The thought that some of our neighbors might be trapped under that water stabbed me like a dagger, but I needed to stay strong, for Maria, for Lucas. I needed to believe that somehow we would be able to rebuild our lives when all this was over. I remembered an old saying my father used to say, "After the storm comes the calm." At that moment, it seemed like a distant promise, but I clung to it like a castaway clings to a plank of wood. The rescuer pointed to a point on the horizon. "That's the temporary base. We set up a care center for survivors." When I saw the lights, a strange feeling came over me, a mix of relief and sadness that I still didn't know how to name. That night, I knew nothing would be the same as before, but I also knew that somehow we had survived the impossible. When we finally arrived at the rescue base, the scene was one of organized chaos. There were makeshift tents, noisy generators, and a line of drenched people, each carrying their own story of loss and despair. Maria and I supported each other as we waded through the mud, following rescuers to a triage area. Lucas, still asleep, was taken to a doctor who quickly checked his vital signs. "He's fine, he just needs rest," assured the doctor, and those words were a rare breath of relief. I looked around, trying to recognize any familiar faces. The expressions I saw were of exhaustion, some in shock, others crying with relief at finding lost relatives. There I realized that, despite all the devastation, there was an invisible force that kept these people standing. Hope. The hurricane had taken away a lot, but it hadn't completely erased the will to live. A volunteer brought us blankets and hot water, simple gestures that made me realize how vulnerable we already felt. Maria was calmer now, and some color had returned to her face. She held my hand, and her eyes reflected the mix of emotions that were also stirring within me. Gratitude for being alive, sadness for everything we'd lost. At one point, a journalist approached with a camera. He looked tired but had an expression of urgency. "Did you guys survive Hurricane Milton?" he asked, and I could only nod. Maria lowered her head, trying to avoid the questions, but the man insisted. What was it like to experience this nightmare up close? I looked at him, at the camera recording every detail of our faces, and I realized I needed to tell the truth. Not just to him, but to myself. It was like being in a war against something you can't see or fight. We just try to survive, 1 minute at a time. I don't know what it's going to be like after this, but we're here. That's it. That's all that matters. He asked a few more questions, but I couldn't hear anymore. My mind was elsewhere, on everything we left behind, on the uncertainties that awaited us. Lucas woke up and looked around, his eyes still swollen with sleep. "Are we going home now, Daddy?" The question took me by surprise, and I just looked at Maria, not knowing what to say. "Yes, son," she replied before I could think. "Let's build a new house. Together." The day dawned with a clear sky, as if the storm had never existed. Rescue teams were still working tirelessly, and I realized that Hurricane Milton hadn't just taken homes. It had also taken pieces of us that might never be recovered. Maria and I held hands as we watched the sun rise through the rubble, a strangely beautiful scene amid the desolation. Days later, we began preparing to leave the temporary shelter. We were given clean clothes, and a bus would take us to a resettlement center in another city, where we would start from scratch. The reporters were gone, and only the volunteers and unfamiliar faces that had been our community remained for days. On the last day before we left, I returned alone to the ruins of our house. The water had receded, revealing complete destruction. I took a piece of wood that had once been part of our living room and put it in my coat pocket. It was not a symbol of everything we lost, but of everything we still had the strength to rebuild. When I returned to the base, Lucas was waiting for me with a tired smile, and Maria hugged me as if she wanted to protect me from any pain. We got on the bus, and as the road stretched out in front of us, I began to understand that the journey would be long, but that we were ready to face it. There was something greater than the destruction of Milton, something that could not be broken, our will to survive. That day, as the bus drove away from what we once called home, I closed my eyes and thought about the words I hadn't said to the journalist. We survived the hurricane, yes, but most of all, we would survive what came next. Because deep down, Milton wasn't the end. He was just the beginning of a new story, one we were still learning to write.